Does that mean you're a student or a professor or what?
Yeah, student and possibly aiming to be a professor. I don't know yet. So I've still got to do my masters and PhD, which will be in a few years away yet.
I see.
Best time of your life. I did my master's in 2006 when I was in my 40s, and I did my PhD, finished it in 2017 when I was in my mid 50s. And so second career, second life.
Well,
Yeah, wow.
I'm 48, so.
So here you go. You're right on track.
Yep.
Good morning.
So, good afternoon. All.
Good afternoon for you in the UK.
Yeah.
So was this a better chapter?
For me, it was because the introduction and the first chapter were a bit rambly and fortunate, and I had to use my rocket book to write down any terms I didn't understand.
There you go. Well, it did seem like it was good that he finally sort of got into the narrative rather than just trying to kind of situate the whole thing. I enjoyed this chapter more as well.
Yes.
Although I did have some issues with it, but we can talk about that, and we'll give everybody else a minute or so to kind of keep arriving.
I saw in the vault that Tracy is running late. So
yes, I noticed that too. Yeah. Although I don't know that it didn't sound like she was saying 5 minutes late. So I think we should probably get going, and then if a half hour into it she rolls in, then she can catch up on the video. So hello everybody. It was almost spring-like this week here. We've still got daffodils blooming. We do have cherries. We've got cherry blossoms in the yard now, and we've finally got lilacs. So the whole when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed thing is happening for us in June, where it normally happens in the Chesapeake Bay area in mid-April, apparently, based on the poem, which is about Lincoln getting shot on my birthday.
Pronunciation on lilac.
Sorry, Tim?
Are you not missing something on the lilacs of lacking? With a waver. There's no K in lilac, right?
Is it? I don't know.
I just say lilac.
Yeah. So this week, I thought this was interesting because I think I mentioned in the vault that I've simultaneously, as I've been walking, I've been doing a lot of walking this week. And my daughter's getting married. My second daughter is getting married in the early August. So I am trying to get in shape. So I've been walking, and I just finished a 36-hour fast. Which I broke with eggs and bacon. So I'm trying to keto and fast simultaneously. So we'll see how all of that goes. But as I've been doing that, one of the things that I have been doing is I've been listening to audiobooks. And for a while there, just because I was so brain dead, I was listening to a lot of science fiction audiobooks. And now I'm still doing that. I'm still listening. I'm kind of going through everything that Neil Stephenson wrote, I think. But I'm also listening. I listened to the first 5 chapters or so of Debt, and I listened to Bullshit Jobs all the way through once. and a little bit of the Democracy Project, which is the Graeber book about the Occupy movement. So all of those have been kind of interesting in combination with trying to think about this, I think, and I think that perspective. I was talking with a guy on Zoom yesterday who teaches sort of applied economics and business finance and stuff at another one of the universities in my system here, and we were talking about different things, different histories of capitalism, and he recommended a couple of books to me about Civil War finance and apparently a history called Ages of American Capitalism, which is an attempt to do U.S. history from an economic or a business perspective too. But I mentioned that I was reading Debt, and he said, "Oh, he's a little bit lefty, isn't it? Isn't he?" And I said, "Well, yeah, he's kind of an anarchist." So that was kind of an interesting moment. Yeah, so a bit lefty, a bit to the left of left, and so it's been kind of interesting. It looks like probably the folks who are here now. So we should probably I should probably stop killing time. We should probably talk about this chapter leans heavily on Kenneth Pomeranz, which I actually did dig into this morning, my comps reading, and I did read his book way back when, about a decade ago, and I wrote a little bit about it, but not apparently not that much. I mean, to the extent I think that probably suggests that I didn't really find him that compelling, right? He does talk a lot. Pomeranz does in that book. For anyone who hasn't read The Great Divergence, which I assume is mostly everybody, he does kind of try to decenter Europe and talk about these, what he calls reciprocal comparisons between parts of Europe and parts of China, in India, and so on, that seem, he says, to have been, hi Chris, that seem to have been similarly positioned within their continental worlds. And so I think that's the thing that I thought was the biggest contribution when I was reading it a decade ago, was that he was actually saying that, that there was a point, actually, and there was a point where he says the East and the West were roughly comparable and were at similar stages of development, and then something happened. Of course, if he had gone further back, he would have, he would have been able to say that, there was an even longer period of time when the East was, remarkably ahead of the West. And so probably there's even more context for this than otherwise there might have been. He says that he talks about vectors of influence moving in various directions. So he is apparently about this idea of that there's something happening here. He also talks a lot. One of the things that I pulled out of it was he talks a lot about the influence of addictive New World stimulants like sugar and tobacco and cocoa and coffee, which he says, along with tea, became mainstays of this mass consumer market in Europe. And he kind of concludes by saying that forces outside the market and conjunctures beyond Europe deserve a central place in explaining why Western Europe's otherwise largely unexceptional core achieved unique breakthroughs and wound up as the privileged center of the 19th century's new economic world. So that's what Piketty is channeling in this chapter. What do you guys think about his use of that and kind of what he wants to be talking about here about slavery and colonialism?
Yeah, since I don't have many conversations with historians, let me ask this question and see if I can relate it. So the notion of, critical race theory has been all over the news. Academics being challenged with, are they using it? Are they not using it? Is it bad or whatever?
Mhm.
So when Piketty talks about kind of the, slavery, at least as I interpret the chapter, being one of the differentiators leading to greater economic development in some places relative to others. I don't know if that's a fair interpretation, but that would be one way. You talk about everybody kind of being, or different nations being kind of similar at one point, and then that's what I assume Pomerantz is getting at. What causes them to differentiate themselves? Slavery, and I mean, that was one of the issues. And if that ends up being then baked into the economic advantages of some nations or regions over others, is that a critical race theory interpretation of, I don't know, present differences, for example?
Yeah, I think the CRT element of it would be that the second part of that statement, right? That there is a legacy of that continues to be kind of relevant to the way that society is kind of organized today, and the differences of opportunity and access and stuff that people have. But yeah, I think that is kind of one of the things that a historian talking about CRT would point to, say that that there are things that happen in the development of especially but not only Atlantic slavery, right? Because debt peonage in the Asian, in the Pacific world, right? A lot of historians recently, in the last decade or 15 years or so, have been working a lot on kind of identifying and sort of equating the thing that is done with Chinese debt peons, right? Being sent to, obviously to California to work in mines and work on the railroads, during the transcontinental railroads, and then also to the Guano Islands off of Peru, right, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, to mine that. And they're basically, in a lot of ways as unfree as enslaved Africans are. But yeah, I think there's a lot. There's a lot kind of leading up to that and setting the stage for that, and then there is that moment of the Atlantic slave trade and of Atlantic world, especially American, and then Brazilian, of course, doesn't end until to the end of the 19th century. And I think that CRT advocates would say that all of that, definitely creates different starting conditions that relate to equity now. I would definitely go with that. One of the things that jumped out at me in the early part of this chapter was that he kind of puts a pin in the Haitian Revolution, right? And he says that, well, up until the Haitian Revolution, Saint-Domingue, and Hispaniola in general was one of the big cotton producers. And so that, as well as sugar, and that had sort of escaped me too. I thought I kind of marked that. I noted that and thought I have to kind of return to this and think about, what happens after, and what that, and if there is some, and Sven Beckert, he cites several times, has written a lot about the cotton economy and the slave world, as well as, he's also kind of focused on sort of New York finance. So that's an interesting sort of combination. One of the things he also kind of makes these comparisons early in the chapter of, where he's talking about resources, right? And I'm thinking particularly of around page 49, where in at least my Kindle version, where he's saying, he's talking about European deforestation, right? And the relative resource scarcity there, at least, and especially relative to the previous situation, right? Where there had been trees, to cut down, there had been forests to cut down in Britain, and then they were able to go to the Baltics and other places in Europe. One of the things that he doesn't mention is that Napoleon prevented the British from doing, from getting tall pines for masts from the Baltic in 1806, I believe. And that was what kind of launched the Canadian maritime lumber industry. What is debt P on the continental? Oh, cool. Thanks, Chris. Silver, yeah, all the silver from Potosi and Zacatecas. Yeah, and this was kind of and that silver that was flowing into, initially it was going from Veracruz to Cadiz, right? And then it was sort of entering the European market by way of Spanish spending, and also because Charles V was the Holy Roman Empire simultaneously with being the King of Spain, right? He was using a lot of that money, especially after the wars of religion began, right, to try to prop up the Holy Roman Empire and fight these wars. And that was one of the other things that Piketty brought up that I thought was kind of really interesting, was this idea that it's these nationalistic wars, and he talks at one point about in India the borders are more fluid or more flexible, right? And so you get this kind of creation, because that's one of the sort of typical tropes of historians, right, is that something is going on in Europe that's creating nationalism, where in the old empires of the East, especially the land empires, right, you have these kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and somewhat cosmopolitan societies, right, which you don't get in Europe, because they tend to differentiate themselves by way of language or culture or ethnicity, and then especially religion in the second half of the especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, right? Another of the things was he talks about the gradual deforestation in China between 1500 and 1800. And I just wanted to point out that that the Hongwu Emperor, when he becomes when the Ming begin, which is like 1368, I believe, he plants 1 billion trees, right? Because the Mongols that had preceded the Ming had basically tried to deforest all of North China and turn it into something that looked like the steppes that they were from. Right, so there's a huge kind of reforestation and environmental ecological project that that at least for Hongwu rules for 30 years till the end, to almost the beginning of the 15th century, and he literally plants 1 billion trees. He builds like 40,000 reservoirs, and he kind of gets the irrigation system running again. So the part of the reason for the difference, and this is, and this is again what I was saying about the scope of Pomerantz. If he had looked before the period that he's focused on, he would have seen things that influence what he's talking about, what he kind of takes as just sort of facts on the ground that are not that are just to be taken for granted. And I don't know that they're really, kind of to be taken for granted. And then he goes on in that, I'm still on page 49, right? Then he goes on to talk about these, kind of going back to what you were talking about, Mark, these, the African labor, this unfree labor from Africa, and then this production of raw materials, what he calls raw materials, wood and cotton and sugar, that and he misses tobacco, of course, which was one of the early ones in the Chesapeake, and that. Oh, hi, I'm here.
Are you doing your international?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay, bye.
All right, see ya. Don't let the cat out. My son, my 16-year-old son, drove my wife and daughter to a neighboring town for breakfast, and they just returned. he talks about these, but the thing that I think is relevant here is that these are commodities, right? These are commercial commodities. And so that's another difference that I'm not sure that Piketty, in my mind, gave enough attention to, right? That there's this shift from, what other early American historians would have called subsistence production to commercial production in this period. So anyway, I've been blathering on for too long. Let me shut up and let other people talk now.
My favorite incendiary part was that he calls China more economically liberal than Europe and even the United States by comparison. Which, to me, it seems like he just comes in and he drops this bomb and kind of moves on a little bit. But I found that, almost stupidly fascinating.
The part where he says that they're more in accord with Smith's ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, okay. No, nobody talks about this. Although I guess these days he put the word liberal in any sentence in most Western contexts, and for half or more of the population, it doesn't have the context that it means when you talk about economic liberalism anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that even in the old fashioned, because Smith, you can't think of Adam Smith as being part of that Enlightenment liberal tradition. You're always a free trade advocate when you're the biggest player in the game, right? So I think that accounts for a lot of the protectionism of the early, and I thought he did a good job talking about how protectionist, especially with respect to textiles, right? You get all of these different laws. You get the Calico Acts as well in 1720 that he didn't mention. And so the Brits are very focused on the fact that they are a tiny, tiny little player in this thing. And, and from that perspective, it does seem like, and also he also mentions the taxation issue, right? Tori, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, because just saying that in the US, it's mostly like a synonym for socialism, but here in the UK, it's pretty much on the same strand as classical libertarianism, but because liberalism became associated with socialism in the States, it started to refer to that strand as libertarianism, where here it's still liberalism.
In the kind of John Stuart Mill tradition?
I'm not too sure because I haven't really read much on him, to be honest. So,
okay.
It's only recently that I started to seriously start reading these sort of things.
I think some of the differentiation is there's the word liberalism as it's used in political discourse, and then there's economic liberalism as it's used in kind of an economic standpoint. So a lot of people, or the way, let's say probably the easiest way, because it spans both the UK and the US, the magazine The Economist uses the word kind of democratic economic liberalism in a sense that encompasses a sense of both political organization and economic organization that defines most of the West. So, international trade. In fact, and I don't know if I mentioned it last weekend, I may have said it in passing, but in some of my memory work, I came across a snippet about Hugh of St. Victor in the 10th, 11th century. And to the best of my knowledge, he may be one of the first people to have put forth the idea of if you're trading with people, you're more likely to be friendly with them and not go to war against them, which is a big push that the US does as they do international trade, and it's, I think, become more resurgent within the context that we're talking about. Mostly, big chunks of Europe were being colonialist powers and holding power over other countries as a means of keeping them in line, or just going in and killing them outright and then enslaving them. Whereas now that frame has kind of moved to, let's have a little more power with them instead of power over them. And that trade becomes that driving force. But it also still, I think, in this chapter, and I think maybe a little in chapter 4, he goes into it some more, the idea of he doesn't ever use the word the power over, but he uses that idea of debt and debt peonage. And there's definitely kind of a level of, or at least I guess within his framing, I've heard other historians look at, we start with slavery and then we move to a slightly less onerous idea of, debt slavery or debt peonage.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we keep moving towards more equality, but you're still enslaving people to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
In some way, it's just a continuum of what that slavery looks like.
Well, yeah, and it'll be interesting just to put that together with wage slavery, right? Where during the run up to the Civil War, right, the late 1850s, there's a big argument going on between the abolitionists in the North and the Southerners. One of their counter arguments is, well, the wage slaves of the North don't have it that much better than our, enslaved Africans, and in some ways have it much worse because they also have this debt issue, and they also have this lack of any type of safety net, right? And old age, kind of being taken care of. So they really leaned into that sort of paternalism of their system. Tim, liberalism, something completely different here in the UK. So yeah, I mean, I think of US liberalism as being kind of organized around, the Democratic Party, right? The New Deal, Keynesianism, right? This idea that there should be a public sector and it should do social welfare kinds of things. And, and the conservative position, either before the Great Depression, which had been sort of the Coolidge, Harding, Hoover, all of whom had Mellon as their Secretary of the Treasury, right? Let's do everything for big business and get out of the way of business interests. And then after that New Deal era, it always jumps out at me that Nixon said we're all Keynesians now, right? And it was really a full decade from that to the advent of Reagan, when it was possible to not be a Keynesian anymore. It was possible to actually go back to being a conservative or a neoconservative thing. Yeah, so wage slavery. What is said about wage slavery in those circles, Torin?
Yeah. It's mostly about talking about the capitalist system, how it encourages people to work for the paycheck and not for themselves, and so you're working for the man,
mm-hmm.
and not for what you want to do in life, and so you're not living your life to your full potential because you're having to live it for somebody else. So that's what they mean by sort of wage slavery type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's remarkable how that's so much like mercantilism, right? Only applied within the country, right? Where if you think of mercantilism as being about this idea that we will be the great, especially as it's expressed by Great Britain, right? We will be the manufacturing center, right? We have these what the words that not Pomerantz, but Piketty is using, like comparative advantage, right? That this is where it should be done because it can be done in the most efficient of ways, right? And so they go throughout their own empire, but also they go to Latin America, right? Even right while John Quincy Adams is writing the Monroe Doctrine, right? They're going to, Bolivar's Congress of the Americas in 1826, and they're not allowed to go there officially, and they're actually not invited, but they show up and they do this thing where they try to convince these newly independent republics in Latin America to get into this mercantilist arrangement with them, where they will, you guys are so good at resource extraction. You be the raw material producers, and send your stuff to us, and we will manufacture it into really low cost, really high quality stuff, and we'll send it back to you, and that will be, the basis of a global economic system that will be as efficient as it possibly can be, which is not exactly untrue. The Whigs lost the 13 colonies proposed by the progressive Tories. That element of English history really fascinates me because, the Whigs who were sort of harking back to the Glorious Revolution, right, and sort of had these what we would now call classical liberal beliefs. Like Burke, it's weird, and then Burke turns around. Then the French Revolution is just a little bit too close to home, apparently. But I think it's really interesting. I think there's a whole lot more, and as I've been beginning to read about these kind of secular radicals in the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, I'm finding that I think there's a lot more to that story of, kind of what's going on, the ferment that's just below the surface in England, and especially, around that period of the French Revolution, and then the United Irishmen as well. I think there's a whole nother, big, there's a whole Pompeii, laying under there waiting to be discovered.
I think it's gotten lost in the news this week because of other bigger pressing events. But one of the kind of big highlights of the last week is the Queen's Jubilee. Of which I've been seeing small snippets of people in countries that have been kind of colonized by the UK, and people saying, hey, I want my life and my country back. But it's been interesting to see some of those like hiding under the surface this last week while reading this book, because there are a lot of people who are just, pomp and circumstance and let's celebrate this thing. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people do it without the tacit knowledge or understanding of just exactly what that, reign in colonialism has meant over the last, 70 years of her reign. Mm-hmm. Or when we watch, we were super addicted to The Queen on, I think it's Netflix.
Yes.
The series.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking about, setting the stage for this.
They romanticize at the beginning of the series her going off to Africa and finding out about the death of her father, and everybody literally, they're not bowing and scraping because I think they realize their father has died, and this you see it more from her perspective of, oh, you're sad for her because her father's died. Meanwhile, everybody there is really scared half to death because what happens in my country now, mm-hmm. when the monarch who has been controlling us is shifting. Yeah. And here's the woman right here in front of me who's gonna go back and control. But that perspective isn't really seen or thought about in those romanticized scenes in Netflix.
Well, Well, yeah, and that whole sympathy for her because she was never meant to be the monarch, right? Because her uncle was going to be the king and all of that. So this poor girl, she's picking up this burden that, yeah, contrast.
Or even and they even go so far. You see close-ups of all the indigenous peoples in those scenes, and they're all in Western dress for the most part. And wearing, the nice brown polished shoes, and it's the amount of erasure that goes on there that just totally goes unacknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, that was kind of reading this book while that was happening during the week, or seeing little snippets of it was, makes it much more painful. But I'm curious if anybody else noticed those types of stories through the week.
Yeah, I didn't realize that there was somebody who there was a tribe that worshipped Philip. It's interesting it is interesting to me to think about, as I'm also, I don't really watch the news, but occasionally, something will pop up on my my YouTube feed about American politics and American leadership too, and how much, I always wonder, how much control these people that we focus on, actually have, and how much of the game are they running, and how much of it is, are they just the figurehead for this, kind of established power that's going to do its thing, one way or another. Another of the things that kind of jumped out at me in this chapter was he talks a lot about the public sector, and I get the sense that this is, that he's an economist and this is what he normally does. But I wonder about how much of the public, how much it's a public and private sector thing. And I'll say more about that after Justin goes. Go ahead, Justin.
I wanted to touch back a bit on what Chris was pulling up there. It's not exactly the stuff that was in the news this week, but the kind of backstory of how the British came to possess Hong Kong from the Opium Wars was not a sector of history I was very familiar with, and it really was well, no wonder they're pissed, and no wonder they don't trust the West at all. That stuff happened hundreds of years ago, and they were so manipulated into and dominated into handing over things and doing things that they didn't want in their sovereign country. There's no reason they should have any faith that we're going to come in and say, do the right thing, be good people, bullshit. Right. So anyway, that's the piece that kind of resonated to me, like you were saying, Chris.
Yeah, and it's like not the James Clavell story, right? I mean, before I kind of learned the history, I read whatever it was, Taipan or Noble House, or all of those books back in the day about how it was these daring and swashbuckling kind of Scots or Brits or whatever they were, who kind of went out there and kicked some Chinese ass and and established free trade. And that whole story of he rushes quickly by it, right? The Chinese in 1729, the dynasty, the Qing actually outlawed opium use, and so it was a full 100 years of their laws being ignored, and smuggling being ramped up, first by kind of Chinese pirates in the South China Sea, but then ultimately by the British East India Company, which was, by the time that the emperor sent Lin Cixu to what's now, to Guangzhou Canton, right? He basically blockaded the European factories where the opium was being stored. And he went in and he seized 20,000 crates. There were 4 million people in China who were addicted. 1% of the Chinese population at the time was addicted to opium. But the problem was that it was the people who had silver, right? It was the people who could afford to buy opium. So disproportionately, wealthy people and, and disproportionately administrators, right? These Confucians, right, who were running everything. And so, so everything becomes deranged, right? And the thing that always happens in China, right, is they lose control of the irrigation system and famine ensues, right? And so this is what happened at the end of the Yuan dynasty, the end of the Ming dynasty. Ultimately, it happens, before the Opium Wars, because there are so many people who are not paying attention to what they should be doing and, and kind of keeping society running because they're addicted to opium. So yeah, he goes and he seizes 20,000 chests of opium, and he doesn't actually burn them, he throws them in the sea. But then in 1839, and so then the merchants complain to London, and and Victoria sends 4 armored gunships, which basically stand out of range. It's like a Gulf War I story, right? They stand out of range of the guns of the Chinese, right? The Chinese just have these little coastal junks, right, that do, that chase South China Sea pirates. And so the four armored gunships stand out of range, and they're actually paintings of this, of them basically shelling these junks, and they're exploding into matchsticks, right? And and that's sort of the beginning of the unequal treaty, and that's how they get 5 in the first unequal treaty. They get 5. The English only get 5 ports, and they get the island of Hong Kong. One of the things that and that kind of goes back to what I was gonna say earlier about sort of the public and the private sector, right? He talks about, because he talks a lot about taxation, right, and about the ability of the state to sort of mobilize people. On page 53, he's talking about, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, Chinese and Ottoman tax receipts in urban areas still amount to between 2 and 4 days' salary, so 1 to 2% of GDP, whereas it's almost an order of magnitude higher for the Europeans. And then he goes on to say that if you're only getting 1% of the GDP, then you can only put 1% of the population in service. And I don't think that that's entirely accurate, right? Because you have this, China had this whole Confucian class of, it's gotten to the point by this time where it's a scholar, gentaller, 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 gentaller.
Always entertaining.
Does that help?
Oh, that's better.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about that.
The groove on is gone.
That's just not good. Okay, so am I back?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So how long did that go on? So I guess what I was trying to say was that this idea that it's the public sector, I think is kind of a little bit messed up, right? That that you've got this whole Confucian class in China that is kind of living off the people that they're ruling over. So I don't think that he's accounting for them. And then on the other side, you've got the British East India Company, right, which is running things in not only China, but also India until 1857. And they're a private business. So I'm not sure how, whether all of this kind of adds up and supports the argument.
I would say, like, at the block level, it sounds right. Like, even, the Confucius class it's not a 10%, or it's not another order of magnitude, right? I mean, I don't really know. You tell me, but it sounds to me like the way you're describing it, it's like maybe a couple more percent of the population that is participating in governance, but it's not an order of magnitude, which is 10% more that you can apply to whatever like problem you want to apply to. And then the East India Company actually goes the other way. Like they might not be factored into the taxes of at the GDP level, but like they're doing stuff that is like what the government wants to do. So it's like a bigger benefit in favor. So it
right. So they're acting on behalf of the state. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I mean,
so
because
there might be some details that like don't quite add up perfectly, but like the point seems very valid. Like it's a couple of percent in one's country, and it's like 10 to 20% like that you can direct the problems in the other country. It's like a big difference.
You think though, because on the other hand, what's the total population of Europe versus the total population of China in 1800? There's got to be, there's like going on 400 million people in China, right? So a smaller percentage of that population is significant in terms of, I mean, how many people do you need running, keeping civil society going? I think the difference that, I would have been happier if he would have focused more on military expenditure, because I think that's the part that becomes really, when he starts talking about the amount of people, in these armies.
Or maybe you frame it in the part of society that's captured by either government control and or business control. Because you can look at, the modern United States, there is the government exerting pressure, and in many senses, corporate pressure that sometimes works with and sometimes against government control. So how much of those two pieces can be captured? And if business interests and government interests are roughly aligned in capturing a chunk of the populace, you're in one shape. Whereas in China at that time, a lot more people were subsistence farmers, kind of self-governing in small spaces. Whereas the rest of China that's either in larger cities or under a government control or business control is kind of, you could think of it as a separate country, in which case those percentages are then dramatically different, because and even in modern China now, you still have, even though huge swaths of people have left small countryside farms and gone to big cities, those small, tiny spaces that are supporting the cities with food and agriculture primarily are still big. So, you can even go back and look at, the Greek polis system. We talk about the big cities like Athens and Sparta, and we very rarely talk about the other half. Mm-hmm. So you have the urban city, but you also have the countryside that's supplying the city with goods and material. And, that same kind of dichotomy works still in the United States. You have, the big elite cities, the New Yorks, the Atlantas, the Houstons, the Austins, the Los Angeles, the major market cities. Mm-hmm. But they only can exist and be supported because you're getting food stuff and agriculture coming out of, the heartland. Right. And it's, what does that dichotomy of countryside versus large city look like as over time as well? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's much more complicated, in other words. Actually, I think also there's probably, especially in this example that he's giving of China, a place to talk about the difference between, subsistence and commerce, right? Because it strikes me that a lot of the Chinese peasantry although I also thought it was interesting that they eliminate feudalism earlier, at least the way that Piketty is defining it. But that there've got to be a lot of a large percentage of the Chinese population has got to be sort of, I would imagine, set aside, right, and not sort of considered in this question of, of what you're talking about, Chris, and what you were talking about, Justin. How, who do we count, and who do we kind of put in these buckets of, of private enterprise, and does it support, the aims of the state, and how big is the government sector, and and all of these things. I also, I've also been reading Bullshit Jobs, or listening to Bullshit Jobs, this week, and so I'm thinking, how much of this activity is, is not, kind of meaningful productively, and is that even relevant?
Well, I always think about how, huge swaths of Western culture are built on early Greek philosophy. And I always think about how much we've lost from the perspective of, people searching for eudaimonia, or happiness in their lives. Mm-hmm. And no one talks about that chunk broadly anymore, but it's there, and people in certain circles talk about it, but we don't talk about, do I, choose a career and a path to enhance my happiness as a person? It's always, what career can I choose to service my personal debt, right, to keep me in as a, productive member of society. So that, like, in some sense, I feel like a debt peon. I'm, a wage slave working towards, that, and almost everyone around me is, there are, none of us are subsistence farmers anymore.
Right.
But it's gone that next level up, is how can you as a nation state put other nation states into debt peonage to you, so that you can either keep them down or control them, which, seems like the primary function of the International Monetary Fund, and, the national banks.
Yes. Yeah. Especially the IMF and the World Bank. Yeah.
In fact, I find that from a historical perspective, it's probably not a coincidence that both Robert McNamara and Paul Wolfowitz were both ran wars for the United States, and then transitioned to the big bank. Yeah. In some sense, I think both of them followed that career path, and maybe had feet dipped into academia as well. So they've got all three parts essentially of the industrial, academic, military complex. I think we left banking out of that phrase, but it's interesting that those two people who have big names and are well known historically now had the same path, and their entire power base was primarily war based and then banking based within their careers.
Right. Well, and then as you already said, Chris, I think after the 2007-2008 crisis, right, then everything has become much more financialized, right? Finance is a much bigger element of everybody's consciousness. So yeah, it's this idea of decentering, I guess the general idea, right, is to sort of decenter the West. There is a moment where he talks about kind of encircling the Muslims, which I thought was also sort of interesting, kind of bringing it back to that on around page 63, where he's mentioning the Portuguese trying to get around Africa. They were also, but it's not as it's not as completely simple as that, right? They were also, they're also looking for a way to get access to Asia, to Asian commerce and the spices and, all of that, which the Muslims were it's not entirely preventing them, but making it much more friction, right? The taxes at Cairo and at Baghdad and the surcharges that they had to pay were ridiculous. So what's going on in here? So the U.S. is in debt to China. Pat says. So is it part of that? Is it also part of that logic of, if you owe $100,000 to the bank owes you, but if you owe $100 million to the bank, you own the bank?
Particularly if you have a massive military to come in and enforce it.
Yeah. And that actually is one of kind of the interesting premises of the Graeber debt book, is that we might, rather than thinking of this as debt, what if we thought of it as tribute? Right? What if we considered that the monies that we're getting by way of, getting everybody to buy U.S. Treasury securities is not the U.S. going into debt to these countries, but these countries paying, because we can't call ourselves an empire and demand tribute directly, right? Instead, we do this other thing, which is, kind of de facto similar, if not identical.
You can just put your finger on why Sargon the Great, ultimately disappeared in history.
Yeah.
It's that difference between, debt and tribute, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me scroll. Let me continue. So
I don't know. One of the things that I was kind of struck by too was the way he outlined how the Britain and the U.S. became colonial powers, and essentially you can only consume so much at home before you've consumed yourself out of existence. So then you have to go find the thing somewhere else. So he outlines that pattern, and then to follow up, has outlined how China is now doing that in the modern world, and is looking into parts of the Middle East and Africa as a way to colonialize and create these vassal states in the same sort of, let's create debt peonage at the country level instead of just at the people level. How can we abstract things one level up?
Yeah, well, and in order to really achieve the economies of scale that you want in manufacturing, right, you have to expand that market, right? So not only do you go to either the colonized world or the economically colonized world, right? Because I think that imperialism continues just as economic imperialism. You go there for not only resources, but you go there for markets, right? And so that was the other half of that negotiation that the English had with the Argentines, right? Saying, don't, and it wasn't until the 1950s, it wasn't until Perón, right, that they started doing, import substitution industrialization, right? Because they were this huge market for manufacturers from the center. And that's what the Navigation Acts were too, right? They were this, and he does mention that kind of obliquely, right? That, that these empires wanted to force people or they wanted to penalize people who didn't use English shipping, right? Well, the point of using English shipping, right, is the same thing. I mean, that's what they did with the American colonists with the Navigation Acts, right? You have to buy, you can only trade with the center, right? You can only trade with the Home Office, and the Spanish had done that. All of the silver had to go to Cadiz. All trade from one colony to the next had to stop at a Spanish port.
It reminds me kind of the kids game of or the idea of a cakewalk, and you play the music and everybody sits down, and every turn you take away a chair, and eventually everybody's out except for one. And if you look at empires over history, and the Roman Empire is certainly a good case, as well as the Mongol Empire, they grew and grew and grew, and money flew back to some center that maintained the power and the control. And eventually, when you can't grow anymore, you totally die because the growth has stopped. The music stops and somebody is left without a chair. And eventually the whole enterprise collapses. And I think we've been incredibly lucky in that we've managed to keep finding ways for wealth to keep going back to power centers in either Europe or the United States to keep the music playing. And you increase or decrease taxes, but the question then becomes, where do we see collapse and problems? And more we're seeing things like massive stock market issues, or the collapse of the real estate market in the US, or in a pandemic you find issues with just-in-time delivery and world markets. So at what point do we get so far out on the branch that things collapse, and then we have the same thing that happens? Does it take 1,000 years, the way it did with the collapse of Rome, for Rome to really disappear? Or does it disappear overnight the way the Mongol Empire disappeared? And where do we get to that? What is that breaking point? How do we look back at history and define what those breaking points were?
Yeah.
Because, at 250 years, the United States is, coming up against the length of time Rome managed to keep itself going. But
I've never read Gibbon. Maybe I should. Maybe it's time to look, that at a century old account of the fall of Rome. It might be timely.
Or has anybody written a better version, an updated version of Gibbon that includes new scholarship that's all happened since then?
Yeah.
And that's the thing I want, but I don't have the patience to write it myself, and I don't think it exists.
Yeah.
That would have been a good Graeber project. That I would have loved to see that as his next book after the 3 he had following.
Right. Yeah.
This one.
Yeah. So in the chat, go in order. Pat, do you want to say something about this, about the additional, in addition to the debt to China? You're mentioning the kind of the transfer of technology, or the theft of technology, or whatever.
I'll go back to Lester Thoreau and the Future of Capitalism, which I mentioned in my notes. Back in 1996, I think it was, when the book came out, I happened to read it. And at the time, Japan was the big threat to the US. And Thoreau gave his opinion that China was so far behind that they'd be a long time for them to catch up. Yet what we've witnessed in our life is the transfer of so much technology and facilities to China to manufacture our goods and then import them to the United States, that we've effectively built up the Chinese state to the position where they're now second only to ourselves, and forecast to become number one. So we've created in the United States, which I think is the center of globalization, this huge power problem that we're going to be facing, we're already facing. And China is building their military strength. Military strength was mentioned, but they're not necessarily going to remain the primary military power in the world, with China being the economic power in the future. They have the capability to build a military system too. And the thought's been going on, as we've discussed, in my mind, what happens if the United States suddenly declares all debt null and void? Is that the point at which we become a global military conflict? China has nuclear weapons as well as Russia. So it's easy to be kind of pessimistic about the future, the way things have gone.
Yeah. Well, there certainly don't seem to be. Yeah, I mean, there certainly seem to be a lot of things that can go wrong. Yeah, I think Diamond didn't talk. I'm watching the chat go as well. Yeah, I think Diamond didn't talk about Rome because he was particularly interested in ecological collapses, right? His part of his thesis was that these places that he wanted to talk about in their, at the end of, at the beginning of their collapses, they had sort of overrun their resource bases.
Well, even if you want to look at Rome, even things like their water system were generally unsustainable. So they were porting in water from hundreds of miles away, and they were doing it largely through lead pipes. So they were slowly poisoning themselves along the way. But if you look at most of what's left of the extant Roman aqueduct system today, almost all of those aqueducts have been turned into bridges for transport across space. But if you've seen the internal parts of those water carrying systems, a lot of them have, a foot or more of, calcium solidified in them. So some of them were 4 and 5 feet deep, and now they're maybe half a foot deep because there's literally so much calcified deposits. And if you don't have the ability to keep cleaning those out to get the water from, the random city in France down to the urban center, especially when you're on the edges of the empire, how do you maintain control?
Yeah,
you need the debt peon to go clean out the trough to keep the water flowing. Which is not too dissimilar from the economic world of Frank Herbert's Dune.
Yeah,
keep the spice flowing. How do we do that?
Flow. Yeah. Written around. So. Yeah, I mean, Rome, I don't know enough about Rome. I don't know enough to really have an opinion. And one of the things that strikes me is, that Rome does, persist as the Byzantine Empire. And so, so what's going on there? What's different? What is making, I don't know myself why, Constantinople is successful, and Rome fails at that moment.
Well, I might say, at least in some part, Rome fails because it starts to fall apart from the center, and then it's got people attacking from the north across the mountains who move in a predatory fashion. In much the same way, the Byzantine Empire starts failing because the Mongols are invading into their space and extracting value out. But I would suggest that it's the beginning of the Roman Catholic, well, not the Roman Catholic, but the Greek Orthodox religious empire that holds the Byzantine Empire together for a big chunk of time. So the power center moves from Rome to, old Anatolia, which is much better protected geographically from where it is, both by mountains, and it's got access to sea trade
Mhm.
more easily. So that, I think that's a bigger confluence of factors of large world forces shifting a power center from one place to another. And it, and then ostensibly even the Byzantine Empire really limps along until it dies at the hands of, Mongol invaders, which,
Yeah.
which I think follows more or less the pattern of the way Rome died itself,
Mhm.
with invaders from,
Right.
Gaulish invaders from the north.
Right. Well, yeah, and that actually gives, that kind of sort of gives you an exogenous cause. So yeah, that helps. So then you don't have to decide, if there's something about Roman organization versus, Western Roman versus Eastern Roman. That's
They're because they're so large. It's an incredibly complex question and problem because there's so many factors at play on both sides and across hundreds of years of history.
Yeah.
It's not as easy as looking at, well, and although at the same time too, we have a lot less evidence for how Sargon's empire collapsed because there's less written about it and we have fewer sources historically and otherwise.
Yeah.
Whereas with Rome and the Byzantine Empire, we have lots of sources, but we still haven't teased all those apart.
Yeah.
Which is also why I want the new Gibbon.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be. I think it would be a good moment for that. Okay, so going back to what's actually in this third chapter. Is he sustaining his point, do you think? I mean, I thought he ended on kind of a wishy-washy note where he says, well, in itself, the state is neither egalitarian nor inegalitarian. Everything depends on who controls it and for what purpose. It's like, okay, well, so what was the point of that? Yeah, well, it could be good.
Wave my hands too.
Yeah.
What I will say though is it's been this chapter, and I think chapter 4 that I've gone through so far are far more interesting, and there's so much more interesting meat in these chapters than there was in chapter 1 or 2 or even the introduction.
Yeah.
I was ready to fall asleep and give up, I think, after chapter 2, and then suddenly he's delivering some fun and interesting and shocking new ideas, I think. So
yeah, I agree.
I thought it was interesting how like chapters 1 and 2 talk a lot about like you can't just look at like money as the only way to describe equality, and then this chapter is all about money. And I was like, okay, I guess we're dropping out of this stuff.
Yeah, I thought at the beginning of the chapter, I thought he wanted to talk about colonialism and slavery, and then by the end, I was like, hey, you fell back in your kind of mainstream economist mode.
Oh, you always fall back to what you know, right?
I guess, yeah. He did. I mean, for a minute there's a center section that I didn't even bother highlighting at all. That just I kind of blew off was the whole his around page 62, 61 to 63, the provincializing Europe and rethinking the West's specificity thing.
Same. I have no underlines in that section, like nothing.
Yeah,
I don't know. Didn't stick.
Yeah, the only thing that I did highlight was this idea of encircling the eternal Muslim enemy. But yeah, the whole idea that, I mean, I think that there probably is something to be said. Probably is a lot to be said about about religion and these organizations, like Chris, you mentioned, is it the, what's going on? Is it the Catholic Church? Is it the Greek Orthodox that's becoming, sort of more influential and more operative here? But yeah, when he's talking about prohibition of marriage between cousins and remarriage of widows and stuff like that, I'm like, no.
Some of that is more in vogue now from the acronym WEIRD. That's or Weird Society. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I don't remember the author, but there's a big book that's come out in the last year and a half that looks at kind of 1,000 years of Western history and the influence the church has had on our societal structure. So we've gone from larger family networks and clans, if you want to use that very loaded word, to smaller super nuclear families. So, you know, ostensibly my family is 3 people, and I have some brothers and sisters and the aunts and uncles and grandparents, but it's my family by itself fighting the good fight. It's not my extended family, of which I have several hundred, but I'm not super close with them in the same way that my counterpart 200 years ago would have been far closer.
Right.
And so big chunks of that are tied into the Catholic Church slowly going from, you know, I think it was like 6th or 7th cousins you could marry. And over the last 1,500 years, that number has gone down, or gone from like, you used to marry, and then Darwin, let's say Charles Darwin's day, you could marry your first cousin, and it wasn't considered a horrible taboo thing. Whereas now I think we're 6th or 7th cousins out. If you follow whatever I think that's roughly the guidance of the Roman Catholic Church now.
Wow.
But that effect over the span of 1,000 years, going from being able to marry your first cousin to, you know, not being able to marry your 10th cousin, has had a dramatic shift on how society works. And my presumption is he's making a nod to that type of research, which has kind of become a thing in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I got that. I got a similar impression that it was about sort of the size of allied family, extended family units, right? Where you go, where, like you said, me and my wife and my kids kind of thing, as opposed to, the Armenians, right? As they're developing these international trade networks that are all based on kinship. I think that's probably where he might have wanted to go in a bigger chapter or something. Go ahead, Justin.
I guess like the way you described it just now, Chris, it felt more like you're really isolating it to like an institutional attitude change, for the reason that like we're not like, I assume most of us in this Zoom call are like more like Chris's description than like the Armenian description of their network of close connections. And I had kind of always just attributed that to like how cheap it is to travel long distances now and how fast it is. And so we just all kind of diffused away from each other and naturally ended up with this thing. And without you having suggested it, Chris, I probably would have, somebody else had said that, I would have been like, the change in the institution is a result of adapting to the change in the world's situation. But it could be like more of both. And also, Dan, your point out about there are still cultures that maintain those close networks even across those distances, and we're just not participating in one. I don't really have a point, just that's an interesting observation and how it's shifted.
Yeah. I think probably employment mobility too, right? I think we are all from a culture that has reached a place, and probably maybe like when I was young was even more in the place than we are now, where you were expected to go away. right? You're expected, you become an adult, you leave, you go to college, your college can be far away, you go to a job, you follow the job, if you get a new job, or if you get a promotion that sends you someplace else, that those are the things that are kind of the central, the important factors in your decisions that you make about your life and your goals and everything.
And that goes back to, I think, one of the things we said at the very beginning about like how we put, instead of what you were saying, Chris, about, again, the Greek philosophy of like trying to pursue make decisions about what will lead to better happiness rather than more economic success. It's not exactly how you phrased it, but like that's kind of the dichotomy we focus on.
Yeah.
Even that idea you mentioned, Dan, of going away to college, and that's at least for a huge chunk, and I think it applies even to equality, but going away somewhere, you're far more likely to meet your life partner at college or university than anywhere else, if for no other reason than you're around a group of people who look, think, and act like you more than anything else. Whereas in prior societies, either in your town amongst someone you know, or the next town over was your dating pool.
Mm-hmm.
And now you may go to a university where there's 10,000 people that you potentially are, well, let's say maybe, 10 probably as good as an average, because that's even half of the average university size. So you have a dating pool that you're more likely to find a mate in, and then you coming from somewhere and someone else coming from somewhere may move off to some random place based on job possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And you're much more mobile and less likely to go and settle down where either you're from or where your wife is from, and even live in I've seen some studies on mobility in Japan over the last 300 or 400 years, and the question in some of those was, whose home did you go live in after you got married? Did you go live in the wife's home, her father's home, or did you go live in the mother's home? So even within elite Japan, there was a family group that held power for over 100 or 200 years, who did it by not having my son be the next emperor, but their strategy was, my daughter is going to be married to the next emperor, and they're going to start their lives out by living in my house. And that was how a family group held power and sway for almost 250 years, was who married whom and whose house did they live in,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, oh, my son needs to be the next emperor, which for a long time, I think, at least within that culture, you were more likely to be killed and deposed and your family line wiped out and disappear into the dustbin of history, versus, oh no, I'll just let it be my daughter and then they'll come live with me, and through that we'll control the power structure.
Mm-hmm. Right. And to generalize from that, not from the Japan example, but from the college example, you also develop, you not only maybe find your mate or your life partner or whatever, but you create an affinity group. You find a circle of friends that that are more relevant to you in a lot of cases than your next door neighbor, back home when you were growing up.
And then it's actually, that may be even accelerated. So I'll take the idea from Zeynep Tufekci, I think, outlined it in kind of social media circles. If you're the odd duck in your small local high school and you don't find your social circle and your friends because you have more cosmopolitan interests above what your small hometown may offer, if you can get online and find a group of people who are interested in a subtopic you're interested in, then suddenly that's your cohort and not the people in the town where you live. Your social bonds, your local social bonds are stripped apart, and now your social bonds are with people who are distant from you. But you couldn't do that, or that was much harder to do in the 1980s, or at least until you're of age to go away to college somewhere and maybe find that in college settings. But now if you're a teenager growing up in modern America, you have social media, so
Your
you
friends
can
are
go,
all on Discord.
you could go find all the goths and hang out with the goths in your Discord channel,
Right.
and not care that you don't have the immediate social network within your own town where you might be ostracized for that kind of, you know, gothic look or emo look or whatever it is that doesn't fit into the current fashion of broad stream America.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is probably especially true. And I wonder about what that means for the mobility of the physical mobility of people, because yeah, I'm sitting here in flyover country, right? I was talking to I was talking to my daughter today. She's in Pittsburgh, and she was, you know, she's talking about what car they're going to get next, right? And I have a Tesla, which is problematic a little bit because up until very recently, it was difficult, especially in the winter, to get any place because the closest superchargers are very far away. Not a problem that you have where you live, Chris. And you know, and we kind of got to, you know, talking about, you know, these issues of kind of the way that, again, business, you know, going back to business and the economy, right? The way that economic decisions are made, you know, they're not made on, you know, on behalf of people like me, right? I mean, we do have a supercharger in town now, which is bizarre to me. 8-stall supercharger. I've never seen anybody at it. But I assume, I mean, I think there are 3 cars in town. So maybe it's for the tourists.
You don't even use it?
I have a charger in my garage. But you know, we don't, a lot of this stuff, you know, we were talking, I guess she was talking about a car, you know, and I said, well, I'm going to have to think about that because, you know, my Model 3 is coming off lease next March and I can't keep it because of, you know, the robo-taxi fleet. And which probably won't exist next March, but I think they'll still prevent me from, you know, from buying it off the lease or renewing or anything like that. And the robo-taxi fleet is such an urban solution, right? I mean, we don't even have Uber here, right? We're never going to have robo-taxis. So these you know, kind of big economic decisions, you know, sort of strategic corporate decisions and governmental decisions are being made, you know, with little or no consideration. So how much of that, you know, it's just to kind of.
I'm not sure I followed all of that, Dan. I'm planning to buy another car in the next couple of years, so we're good to go against robo-taxis for a while yet.
Well, and that whole idea that, you know, that owner, you know, the car ownership won't even be a thing. I mean, it's like almost the Appleization of, you know, of everything. But go ahead, Chris.
I'm kind of curious. And going back to kind of equality and social structures and the increase in equality, I'm kind of curious, and you could look at the bisexual, gay, lesbian movement over the last, I think it's now 50 years since Stonewall, if I remember. But we ultimately had a society that was large enough to have a gay bar in New York that was a social center for enough people to create the beginning of a movement, or socially acceptable cities like San Francisco, where people felt a little easier and or felt it was easier to be open about who they were and their sexuality,
Right.
to then create a center of mass to say, hey, we need some kind of equality, or we're going to stand up and do this thing. Kind of in the same way, it totally got squashed, I think, in the 60s. And it's history we don't talk about. And I find it's super apropos this week with gun control being front and center in the news again. But the Black Panthers organizing in Oakland to create the idea of cop watching, and hey, let's go out and we'll get guns and we can follow cops around and watch them and provide people on the street who are being stopped and hassled while we're armed. We can provide them legal advice while they're being stopped. So this was happening in like 66, 67, I think. And so naturally, the Republican government at the time in California, and Reagan was the governor who signed it into law, but they presented essentially a gun control law to say you needed to have a permit from the local police to carry a gun.
Right.
And ostensibly it was done to take guns away from the Black Panthers so that they couldn't police the police.
Right.
And
That's
literally
beautiful.
that law actually got accelerated because the Black Panthers showed up at the California State House to say, hey, you're not going to take the guns away from us because this is providing us freedom and flexibility. So then it's, ostensibly he rehabilitated his career with the NRA subsequently, but Reagan actually wrote into law one of the biggest gun control things in the middle of the last century.
Wow. That's interesting. That reminds me of Dave Chappelle has a joke about that kind of it's kind of a long joke, so I won't try to reproduce the whole thing, but it's all about so the punchline is, and that's why we have, so he's talking about the trials of being Black in America, and he says, and the punchline, when he comes around to it is, and that's why we have to register, and he pauses for a beat, and he says, for a legal firearm, right? And everybody, and everybody's like taken aback, and he's like, because that's the only way they're going to change that law.
Yeah, well, and it's I didn't know until recently that the Second Amendment was actually ostensibly put into the Bill of Rights because who was it? I don't want to misquote it. I think it was Patrick Henry and George Mason famous of George Mason University. Mason was an anti-federalist and more on the states' rights side. And at the time, I think he was actually governor of Virginia. But they argued that they needed that part in the Second Amendment about well-regulated militias was because they felt the South needed to have guns and militias locally so that they could put down slave revolts should they happen, and not rely on what they felt would be an unreliable federal government to come in and quell slavery. Because you don't want to rely on New York or Connecticut to send down a militia to put down a slave revolt, which assuredly is going to happen.
Right.
So both Patrick Henry and George Mason had the Second Amendment thrown in there specifically so that they could quell slave revolts at the time.
Yeah. Well, and a militia is locally controlled,
and if you're, and we've now have reframed that. And I think Scalia and I think he wrote the Heller opinion, if I'm not 100% mistaken, but double check me on it. But modern gun control and the pro-NRA movement are super thrilled that Scalia has kind of reframed it as, no, we wanted to have guns in our homes because we were worried about the British or other governments coming in to take over and we could fight back. But really, I think if you want to be a constitutional originalist, you have to go back and look at that Patrick Henry and George Mason business, because they literally wrote at the time contemporaneously, this is why we want this thing in there. And we have enough power to make Jefferson put it in. So we're going to do that. And, so the modern Republican Party, I think, who for the most part want to say, let's go back and be originalists so we can make America great again. But that's the thing. So if you want to be an originalist, let's talk about that. And I don't hear anybody talking about that, at least in the mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that some people sort of generalize from that to the idea that, that militias are locally or at least at most state institutions, right? And so that would be the check on a strong federal government, right? So even in a place, you might even have an advocate of that, of a militia law from the north, from, for example, Vermont, although Vermont wasn't a state at the time that this was all being discussed. But Vermont was a huge thorn in the side of New York and New Hampshire. Tim, do you want to close us up by sort of talking a little bit about about towns and cities and what you're thinking of here, technology,
Yeah.
how that influences.
The two YouTubers that I mentioned have overlapping, and I think they've actually paired up a couple of times. And there's other third parties doing the same. And more academically, you can link into Jeff Speck, who's much more of a walkability type person, whereby you get improvements in health because everybody has to walk something rather than just drive your car across the road to go to the bank. Equivalent. And the Not Just Bikes guy is a Canadian who's moved to Amsterdam and now cycles like a Dutchman. So he doesn't try and look like Eddie Merckx doing the Tour de France. He looks like he's going to the office or going to the shops. And the parallel to that is that half of the shops he needs in Amsterdam is a walk around the corner. So he can get his pharmacy, he can get his bakery, he can get some of his grocery stroke butchery, and he can get a few other things immediately on the street that he lives in or round the corner. As opposed to, he used to live, I think it was in East London, Ontario, and he had a bus ride to work with a 400-meter walk to his office. That meant he had to walk at one point like 300 yards of it across a major intersection where there was no pavement. So no space for the pedestrian at all. Yet there was a bus stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that he doesn't pick up on it so much, but the City Beautiful and the guys that pair up there pick up with just how get clips from 50s and 60s and even 70s with people who are saying, oh, we like the neighborhood, it's a nice neighborhood, I know we don't want those Negroes here. It's literally as verbatim as that, such that the pricing of the property and even the leases in many cases, although they were earlier, pre-World War II, I think. They may have existed a bit later. Actually prohibited sale to Negroes sometime down the line. So you had a white neighborhood because what else are you going to do?
Mhm.
And the one that I periodically come back with on some of those is that you go a little bit further back and you see guest houses or swimming pools with no blacks, no Jews, no Irish, and no dogs. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how institutional it was. And I periodically enough, I'm a big, not so much practice now because I live in the desert, but I used to be a big on gardening. And of course, most of you lot are from the land of the free. Yet most of your housing, if you have a front yard, is controlled by your lease as to what you can plant in your front yard. How is it that all of you people there with your guns have not gone down the OHA office and blown the place to kingdom come? You know, why are you leaving it to the 18, 20-year-olds to shoot up the schools? You know, I don't understand your psychosis.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that. So, yeah,
But seriously, even if you just pick off with Jeff Spark has done a couple of TEDs on humanistic cities, and he's not even talking about small towns or bigger towns. The city and where the money comes from within the city is invariably taking from the poor to give to the richer districts simply because they're spaced out. You know, you go to the richer district and it's all single people homes with 10-acre gardens versus condos and tower blocks with 500 people an acre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that will, as population, as demographics change, and as population density changes, and as, you know, and as the cost changes, I mean, I live on a dirt road, so nobody pays any attention to what I do out here. But you know, but I'm thinking, you know, well, once the kids are gone, you know, I mean, we had chickens and goats and things out here, you know, and that was why we came here for the, you know, for that experience. But, you know, when the kids are gone, we're thinking, well, you know, it might be fun to be a little bit closer to, you know, the city and, you know, and, you know,
Hospitals.
well, yeah.
As you get older.
Yeah. Yes, we do have a good helicopter here, but yeah, but yeah, and that is kind of a you know, moving to a place that is, I mean, like the Twin City. I mean, Minneapolis is a peaceful place, except that it isn't George Floyd, right? And so yeah, so it's crazy. There's a lot.
I'll give you a fun anecdote, because I grew up in the rural foothills of the North Georgia mountains, and I'll whip out my accent if it helps while I tell this story. But pure Appalachia and large swaths of the Scots-Irish who immigrated to the US, settled that swath of the country. And their goal from a cultural perspective was not to live in big cities and close to other people. So they would find plots of land, and instead of building their home right up on the road, next to the road, within feet or 100 feet of the road, like other large portions of America are done and planned.
Mm-hmm.
In the Appalachians, you built your property, you built your house as far from all of your neighbors as you possibly could, so that you could be away. And I think there are huge parts of America who don't know or see or understand that as a cultural phenomenon. But I know when I'm driving through, I to a great extent, I can tell if you put me blindly in the middle of America somewhere, I could tell if I'm in an Appalachian space or not based on that fact alone.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea of the hollers, of being,
actually lived next door in Georgia to a family whose name was Holler.
Oh, wow. And where they from?
Which even super highlights this.
Yeah. That idea. Well, and again, I mean, that goes, I mean, to bring that around to some of the things that we've been talking about way back when we were talking about Graeber and Wengrow. I talked a little bit about James Scott, right? Who was all about this whole idea of, I mean, his whole thesis of Southeast Asia was that you could tell more about people and about little societies from their elevation than you could from where they were located on the map, right? And and that had to do with, I mean, his idea was that people went to the upcountry or the backcountry or far from the population center, which was normally around a river or a port or something like that, to avoid being counted and controlled and taxed and even have, I mean, they didn't even have we didn't have last names until we had taxes. So, but it is 11:45 where
this was a good chapter.
It was a good chapter. So next time it'll be chapter 4, which hopefully will be equally interesting. It's about reparations. So there should be something for us to find to talk about.
Something.
All right. Have a good week. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
I hope you have a good week.
Thank you. Take care.
And you. Bye.